My name is John Morris from Komazawa Women's University. I'll be chairing this session. I'd like to say a big thank you from my fellow panelists, Ueno Daisuke and Kozawa Naohide, to our convener, Professor Terwin, and to our volunteer. I'd like to remind everybody that this meeting is being recorded, so please be aware of that. Any problems with that, please tell the conference organizers. Our panel this morning, as you know, is called Reexamining Buddhist Institutions in Early Modern Japan. It presents research contributing to a re-examination of Buddhist institutions, Kyodan, in early modern Japan. Previous research has generally discussed Buddhist institutions largely in terms of the head temple branch temple system, the Honmatsu Seido, and the temple parishioner system, the Jidan Seido, emphasizing the overall control exercised by the shogunate. We examine materials demonstrating the more nuanced realities of religious institutions in the Edo period, exploring their relationships with local communities and feudal overlords. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Hozawa Naohide, who will present the regulation and control of Buddhist temples in early modern Japan. Professor Hozawa, please.
Hello, my name is Hozawa Naohide, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of History at Toyo University, where I do research on early modern Buddhist institutions. Today, I'd like to talk about a perspective to reapply the current discourse on the shogunate regulation and on Buddhist institutions in early modern Japan. This presentation reconsiders commonly accepted views regarding the shogunate's regulation and control of religion, specifically Buddhist institutions, temples, and priests in early modern Japan. It aims to identify the key features of this regulation and control. Tsujiden Nosuke argues that the temple parishioner system, Jidan Seido, and the head temple branch temple system, Honmatsu Seido, led to Buddhist institutions' complacency and formalization. Soon thereafter, scholars primarily learned from Buddhist temples sought to overcome this theory of early modern Buddhists to decline and Buddhism's formalization. However, subsequent research, influenced by the 1980s and later scholarship of early modern Japan historians, such as Takano Toshihiko, Samada Yoshio, has not been primarily concerned with this task. Such negative understandings of early modern Buddhism were premised on stereotyped views of the regulation and control of temples, namely, that a system to regulate and control religions was firmly put in place at the beginning of the early modern period, and that this system dictated the organizational structure and activities of Buddhist institutions and temples until the end of the early modern period. In recent years, leaving behind the yokes of this theory of Buddhism decadence and formalization, research on various topics has advanced. These topics include temples, monks, Buddhist institutional structures, and the relationship between Buddhist institutions and the power of the shogunate and domains. Such research, in which I have been involved since the 1990s, attempts to change stereotyped views of the regulation and control of temples during the early modern period. However, despite this, generally speaking, these views still nebulously persist. This presentation will present the reality of the head temple branch temple system, the temple parishioner system, and the regulation and control of temples, as well as the related perspectives on them. To do so, I will also discuss several examples. The regulation and control of religion. In order to closely examine the reality of the shogunate and domain regulation and control of temples, one must consider what concretely prompted the shogunate measures that scholars have traditionally consisted to be the regulation and control of religion. This includes ordinary political issues that are not part of this sphere. In the early modern period, the shogunate adopted policies banning or restricting the construction of new temples and shrines. These policies also influenced domains. In reality, though, new religious facilities continued to be constructed throughout the early modern period. New construction happened in connection with social changes such as the expansion of cities, as well as circumstances on the side of feudal lords, such their relocation to a different domain by the shogunate, tempo. However, at certain times, the shogunate would at least ostensibly ban the future construction of any new temples. Okuwa Hitoshi asserted that this prohibition was policy to set in stone the status of temples as state organs that carry out population registry and certification work, terauke. However, in the first place, actual terauke duties were generally shouldered by not temples but villages. Also, examining the restrictions placed on temple and shrine construction over time, we find that these were measures to address specific problems related to public order and land. We do not find the thorough enforcement of such prohibition repeatedly taking place in the same fashion. Ensuring temples' status as terauke organs was not the primary motivation for restricting new temple construction. In this way, it is necessary to consider the meaning of temple regulation and control while taking into account how temples existed in society. Original independent Buddhist institutions and the shogunate. When scholars hear the phrase, the regulation and control of Buddhist institutions generally, they think of the shogunate keeping tabs on all temples without exception by establishing a head temple for each denomination and turning smaller temples into their branch temples. However, in reality, not all denominations formed countrywide institutions, and not all temples were part of their denomination's institutions. Here, I will discuss examples of several regional Buddhist institutions. There are 4 Shin Buddhist head temples in Echizen Province, Fukui Prefecture, referred to as the Echizen Shikahonzan. They are Goshoji, Joshoji, Senshoji, and Shojoji. Under the rule of each of these head temples were around 10 to 40 branch temples. Also, these head temples' families would frequently have males from the nobility, warrior class, or other Shin school temples marry into them, yoshi, as well as create relationships with nobles roughly similar to those between godparents and godchildren, yushi. Speaking generally, the records of main temples, branch temples, Honmatsucho, that denominations submitted to the shogunate are not all extant, even if we include copies. There are almost no extant ones from the Shin sect. Joshoji is the only of these 4 Echizen temples that we find recorded in a Honmatsucho, a Tendai sect Honmatsucho nonetheless. This Honmatsucho describes Joshoji as belonging to the Ikko sect, Shin sect, and under the rule of the temple Toezan Kan'eiji. It also lists Joshoji's number of branch temples, but not their names. Each of these 4 head temples entered into relationships with Tendai sect Monzeki, temples led by imperial or noble family members, were given a degree of status by that Tendai sect. Also, the Tendai sect acted as intermediary when these temples acquired official ranks from the imperial court, Kan'i. Goshoji acquired the status of Juninge from the Tendai sect Monzeki temple, Shorein. Inge are temples that ranked below Monzeki. The prefix Jun means quasi. Joshoji was probably Toezan's Juninge. According to Shorein's record, Kacho Yoryaku, Shojoji became Shogoin's Inge. However, as late as the late early modern period, we cannot detect any relationships between Shojoji and Shogoin. Senshoji, on the other hand, became a Juninge of Myohoin, but the latter saw the former as its branch temple. Senshoji objected, and after dispute, distanced itself from Myohoin. A noble family then came to act as the intermediary when the head priest of Senshoji would apply for official ranks from the imperial court. As can be seen in the cases of Zojoji and Senshoji, relationships with Tendai sect Monzeki were unstable, and nobles could instead act as intermediaries when head temples applied to the imperial court for official ranks. Generally, orders from the shogunate and the communication of information to the shogunate did not go through such a Tendai Monzeki. If these head temples had been national Buddhist institutions, they would have had an administrative temple, Fudegashira in Edo, handling communications with the shogunate. In the case of these four head temples, though, they did not have anything like an administrative temple in Edo or Ichizen province. These head temples themselves also played the role to province administrative temples. The shogunate's orders generally were transmitted to a local feudal lord, such as that of the Fukui domain. Then, the local feudal lord would share the order with the head temple, and the head temple would in turn share the order with its branch temples. However, depending on the item in question, sometimes the shogunate would directly contact the head temple, and there were also cases in which the jinya, the administrative organ of nearby territories directly managed by the shogunate, would contact the head temple. Also, sometimes a village in which a branch temple was located would transmit shogunate orders if it had received from that domain. There were multiple transmission routes. In this way, these four head temples were not compelled to become a part of national Buddhist institution or have a relationship with the Tendai sect Monzeki. They were permitted to exist as religious organizations that were, for all intents and purposes, independent. It appears that the shogunate kept tabs on and ruled over these temples and their branch temples in a way that was in accordance with their status as such. Temple management and operations. Lastly, let us turn to individual temples, in particular those terminally located in main temple branch temple relationships. Scholars have tended to understand individual temples in terms of the shogunate or domain feudal lords' management of residents and Buddhist institutions, exploitation of parishioners. Such understandings see the main temple branch temple system and the temple parishioner system as having existed as a set. However, with regard to the management of residents, it was villages and towns that created religious affiliation registries, Shumon Aratamecho. It is also problematic to simplistically see temples as only belonging to Buddhist institutions. In other words, temples came into existence for various reasons, meaning that there were a variety of different actors that influenced them. Temples were sometimes a Buddhist hall shared by a village or familial group. The ancestral Buddhist hall of a power holder, Jibutsudo, or a feudal lord under the strong influence of the main temple. Often, villages influenced the management and operations of the temples located therein, or even shouldered some temple duties. In some cases, the likes of villages and parishioner organizations were involved in temple administration with the approval of, for example, the regional head temple, Chuhonji, or administrative temple, that in the administrative structure of the denomination had direct jurisdiction over the village temple in question. Allow me present one example. In the rural village of Hikokura, located along the Naka River on the outskirts of Edo, approximately 20 kilometers northeast of Edo Castle, in Nigohan Territory, Katsushika District, Musashi Province, There is the Shingo sect temple Enmein. Enmein is a branch temple of the nearby regional head temple Enmyoin. The Kokuzo hall on its grounds would bustle with visitors monthly on the day connected to Kokuzo Bosatsu. While monetary offerings at this hall provided income, it appears that this temple had management difficulties. Parishioners of Enmein were also located outside of Hikokura, and in Hikokura, there were also parishioners of other temples. When the head priest of Enmein was replaced in Horeki 13, 1763, the new head priest, village officials, and parishioners' representatives decided that for 10 years, Kokuzo monetary offerings would be given to the village, which it would use to pay back the debt left by the previous head priest and construct a new temple building. The head priest would be present when the monetary offerings were tallied, and repairs to the temple's main hall would be covered with the likes of income from a farmland and a fund. This income was originally meant for such repairs. Furthermore, it was decided that the head priest could freely use the income he would receive from the administration of fields and other types of land, as well as his compensation for religious acts done for parishioners. These contracts were delivered to the head temple in Myoin. However, this head priest would leave around 80 ryo of debt when he died from illness in IA2, 1773. Reasons included the over 8 ryo in debt he took on after coming down with an eye disease while training at Hasedera, as well as money used to construct a temple building. Therefore, upon Rizui becoming the next head priest, after deliberations, the village's peasants decided to have land management related income, Kokuzo monetary offerings, and biannual Kokuzo Tomyoryo donations placed under the management of the village for 3 years and use this money to repay the temple's debt. They also decided that the head priest's compensation for religious acts for parishioners would be the only income under his control during those 3 years. Agreements were also established regarding Enmein head priest succession. Taken together, these facts indicate that the situation was as follows. Normally, all Enmein income was controlled by the head priest, who would use it for temple operations. This included income related to Kokuzo Hall, land management related income, income from parishioners, and monetary offerings. However, frequently, the temple would go into considerable debt due to a large amount of money being spent on temple building repair, temple operations not going well, and so on. In such cases, the next head priest would, with the approval of the head temple Enmyoin, enter into a contract with the temple's village and its parishioner organization so that debt could be repaid and temple buildings constructed and or repaired. Such contracts specified that the village and the temple parishioner organization would manage part of Enmein's income, excluding compensation for the head priest's religious acts for parishioners. Next, I will discuss contracts dictating that temples would not have head priests. These appear to have been over 250 Shingo temples in our province, southern Chiba Prefecture, during the early modern period. In Temple 14, 1843, the shogunate investigated temples without head priests called Mujuji throughout Japan. The investigation found 113 such Shingo temples in our province. In other words, about 40% of Shingo temples in the province did not have a head priest. The investigation also looked into the reasons for the lack of head priest. The biggest reason, found in over half of the cases, 66 of them, was that it had been decided to build a fund for temple reconstruction and or stable management by not installing a head priest for some time. The temple's village parishioner organization, or in some cases, a group of priests would manage all temple income, including that which would normally belong to the head priest. Let us turn to an example of one such contract. Zojoji, a Shingo temple in Eda, a rural village on the southern Boso Peninsula in our provinces, our district. Today, Tateyama City, Chiba Prefecture, was a low-status branch temple, Monto, of the nearby regional head temple, Hoshuin. In Horek 13, 1763, the village officials, representatives of the village peasants, requested that Hoshuin, which was also our province administrative temple for the denomination, enter into a contract. In their request, they wrote, previously, we asked for the temple not have a head priest for 4 or 5 years for the purpose of temple repairs. In response, you permitted the temple not to have a head priest for 2 years. However, being a poor temple, we think that repairs cannot be done without a priest for only 2 years. With that said, we cannot make the same request again. So first, we would like the temple to be without a head priest for 1 year, and then examine the temple's assets. Depending on what we find, 1 year or later, we would like to ask to still not have a head priest or request a new head priest. Here, people on the village side who want to have no head priest at the temple, and the regional head temple, which is trying to make this time period short, and are negotiating. While it is unclear whether the village's request was accepted without modification, subsequently, Zojoji would often enter into such contracts. Similar contracts are also found at temples in other areas and of other denominations. Conclusion and proposal. I have shown the following in this presentation. 1. In some cases, shogunate and domain feudal laws, regulation and control of temples and priests did not necessarily aim to regulate and control religion. 2. Scholars have usually held that the shogunate systematically organized national level Buddhist institutions, which this orientation was present on the whole. In reality, there were also regional organizations and temples not incorporated into national institutions. The shogunate kept tabs on them in a way that matched this reality, not forcing them to join these national institutions. 3. We cannot see individual temples as only subordinate members of umbrella religious institutions due to the factors that led to their establishment and the foundations for their existence. Villages and parishioner organizations were frequently involved in their management. They should be understood as fields where relationships were formed between priests and other actors, such as parishioners and village people. With this all in mind, I again want to assert that it is necessary to grasp the control and regulation of temples in early modern Japan, while widely taking into account developments in political history, how temples were actually organized, and how temples existed in society. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Professor Horzawa. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Reno Daisuke, who will present on administrative temples in early modern Japanese Buddhist institutions, the system and its regional foundations. Professor Reno, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ueno Daisuke. I'm an associate professor at Keio University who specializes in early modern Japanese history. Focusing on Buddhist thought and Buddhist institutions, I consider how people and society existed during that time. I have primarily been working on cases from the Shinsect, Chodo Shinshu. In this presentation, I will concretely discuss the administrative temple system, Furegashira Seido, of Buddhist institutions and its regional foundations, as well as touch on its relationship with shogunate and domain feudal laws. Existing research on Buddhist institutions has emphasized regulation and control by the Edo shogunate, focusing on the main temple branch temple system, Honmatsu Seido, and the temple parishioner system, Jidan Seido. However, in recent years, scholars have been attaching more importance to other systems and the characteristics of denominations and regions. Also, they have been working to reconsider the temple policies of shogunate and domain feudal laws. One example is the research of Dr. Hozawa Naohide. With such research trends in mind, I focus on the administrative temple system of Buddhist institutions. First, I will explain the administrative temple system. Denominations, head temples, Honzan, as well as shogunate and domain feudal lords, made powerful temples throughout Japan into administrative temples. These administrative temples transmitted the orders of these head temples and feudal lords to subordinate temples, as well as passed on subordinate temples' petitions and other items to these head temples and feudal lords. While the degree to which administrative temples were established varied by denomination and region, generally, the establishment of province and district administrative temples went into full swing during the first half of the 17th century, and from the 18th century onwards, they would mature as one important system that supported Buddhist institutions. Administrative temples developed organizations for carrying out their duties, and some ruled over subordinate temples on their own, standing in for head temples. Administrative temples existed across the country and were Buddhist institutions' contact points for negotiations with feudal lords. Particularly notable is Edo administrative temple's role as such. In the first half of the 17th century, each denomination established an Edo administrative temple. Dr. Udaka Yoshiaki has researched this. Please have a look at this figure. It shows the connections used when Honganji Buddhist institution and the shogunate or domain would communicate. To some degree, this also applies to other denominations. The figure is divided geographically into Kyoto, Edo, and the Daimyo Province. The gray parts are temples. Under the Kyoto head temple are subordinate temples. In Edo and the Daimyo Province, there are administrative temples and their subordinate temples. In Edo, senior councillors are presiding over shogunate politics under the shogun. And the senior councillors are commissioners called bugyo that oversee temples and shrines, towns, and finances. Temple and shrine commissioners are connected to the Edo administrative temple. The Kyoto deputy and city commissioners, both shogunate officials, are also connected with the head temple. Kyoto City Commissioners are in charge of issues related to temples and shrines. Turning to the Daimyo Province, retainers oversee domain politics under Daimyo. The temple and shrine commissioners under these retainers are connected with the administrative temple of the Daimyo Province. There are also connections between the Daimyo's Edo liaison and the Edo administrative temple, as well as between the domain's Kyoto liaison and the head temple. In some cases, related historical materials remain at temples that once served as administrative temples. These provide important clues when thinking about the relationship between Buddhist institutions and feudal laws. Here, I will share some examples. First, let's turn to Edo administrative temples. One of the most famous is Zojoji, which belongs to the Jodo sect Shinzei school. In Keicho 3, 1598, it moved to Shiba in Edo, which belongs to the Jodo sect. This temple flourished as one of the family temples of the head Tokugawa family. At the Edo administrative temple of Jodo sect Shinzei school, Zojoji oversaw Shinzei temples in a total of 17 provinces. Dr. Udaka Yoshiaki has published research on this as well. An office was established in the head priest's quarters of Zojoji, and it became the organ that led temple's operations under the head priest. The priests who worked at this office made decisions after consulting with each other and negotiated with the shogunate's temple and shrine commissioners. Next, let us turn to Tsukiji Gobo, which today is called Tsukiji Honganji. It belongs to the Nishi Honganji school of Shin sect. Around when the Edo shogunate came into existence, Honganji, which had been the head temple of the Shin sect, was divided into Nishi Honganji and Higashi Honganji. Both temples are located in Kyoto. Tsukiji Gobo became Nishi Honganji's Edo administrative temple, and Asakusa Gobo became that of Higashi Honganji. Gobo temples were like the satellite offices of the head temples. Nishi Honganji school temples in the so-called 13 Kanto provinces became subordinate to Tsukiji Gobo. Tsukiji Gobo also engaged in negotiations with the shogunate as an Edo administrative temple. Allow me to explain a bit about the internal organizational structure of Tsukiji Gobo. The highest post was referred to as the Rinban. Midoshu priests from Nishi Honganji assumed this position. The term Rinban, which means rotation, was used because Midoshu priests would rotate through this position. There were normally 2 Rinban priests, a head and an assistant. Priests served as Rinban for several years. The length of time was not clearly decided. A variety of other posts, such as Yakuso, Koromoban, Reaku, Hinoban, and Monban, were also established and assumed by priests and lay followers. Not only did Rinban transmit the shogunate's orders to people in the Nishi Honganji institution, they also persistently negotiated with the shogunate's senior counselors, as well as temple and shrine commissioners, in order to make their institution's requests become a reality. Incidentally, compared to Zojoji, Tsukiji Gobo was more subservient to each school's head temple in Kyoto. In other words, Tsukiji Gobo was the Edo satellite office of Nishihonganji. On the other hand, Zojoji didn't have Rinban come in from outside like Tsukiji Gobo. Rather, Zojoji had its own head priest. Also, it constructed a powerful position within the Jodo sect Shinze school. Both Zojoji and Tsukiji Gobo would end up having jurisdiction over large regions, but the details of when this was decided are unclear. This is a subject I would like to look into. Now, I will discuss regional administrative temples. Due to time constraints, I will focus on one example. Seikoji was an administrative temple of the same-sect Nishihonganji school. It had jurisdiction over two provinces, Suo and Nagato. These two provinces were ruled over by daimyo of the Mori clan. It appears that around Keicho 9, 1604, Seikoji was built in Suo province's Yamaguchi, and that around Keicho 12 or 13, it moved to Hagi in Nagato province. Hagi, the home base of the Mori clan, had been developed into a castle town. Under Nishihonganji, Seikoji presided over these provinces. However, it was a branch temple of the Nishihonganji branch temple Koshoji. In other words, it didn't directly belong to Nishihonganji. The powerful Kyoto temple Koshoji existed in between them. Koshoji had close connections with the Mori clan. Its 18th head priest Junson took Mori Terumoto's adopted daughter Chojuin as his wife, who gave birth to Junen, the first head priest of Seikoji. Also, Junson was made the founder of Seikoji, and it was decided that Seikoji would be under the direction of Koshoji as its joint appointment temple. Also, same-sect temples in Suo and Nagato were ordered by the Mori clan to provide assistance from their subordinate positions to Koshoji. In this way, from the perspective of Koshoji, its connections with the Mori clan opened up the path for it to rule over Suo and Nagato Shin temples via Seikoji. Dr. Kodama Shiki has published work on such matters. In the administrative temple system, temples were organized by region. Subordinate temples were not necessarily just scattered in various places within these regions. In some cases, nearby temples in the area under the administrative temple's jurisdiction would be organized into associations, kumiai. These associations were comprised of an association head temple that served as a coordinator, referred to as kumigashira, and other temples. With nearby temples being able to keep an eye on each other, these associations both played mutual surveillance and mutual aid roles. Based on this head temple, administrative temples, associations arrangement, not only were various reports submitted and orders issued, but also temples and priests were mobilized, money and goods are exchanged, doctrine and moral deportment were regulated, and illegal acts brought to trial and punished. Furthermore, temples also made decisions together, took joint responsibility for problems, and came to each other's aid. For example, the subordinate temples of Seikoji were also organized into temple associations. In Suo and Nagato, from the Mid-Edo period onwards, almost half of all temples belonged to the Shin sect. Almost all of these Shin temples were part of the Nishihonganji school, with these provinces having many temples from the same denomination. It was easy for associations to develop. While Kenjōin was serving as the second generation head priest of Seikoji, 1634 to 77, small congregational gatherings, koyori, were established, and in Tenna-2, 1682, they installed coordinators, or kumigashira. This is the formation of the associations. Seikoji granted these associations a degree of autonomy and hoped that they would address disputes and present it with money and goods. Seikoji also decided that these associations would transport envoy priests going around to temples, as well as carry out other duties. The above has become clear from historical materials passed down at Myorinji, a temple in Nagato Province's Mine district that served as the association's coordinator. Looking at other historical materials, we realize that Shin-sect temple associations in So and Nagato varied in geographical scope from one municipal village to almost one district. The number of temples in associations varied from only a few to over 10. We also find connections between ko, which were confraternities of lay followers, based on geographical ties, and neighboring temples. These confraternities came into existence due to various circumstances. Some operated autonomously, while others connected with neighboring temples to function as subordinate organizations of the Buddhist institution. For example, in the Shin sect, lay followers from 20 or 30 households would hold small confraternity meetings with invited priests from nearby Shin temples once or twice a month. Dr. Kodama Shiki studied this. There were also large confraternities that included temple associations within them. Already researched examples include the confraternities organized by Nishihonganji school priests and lay followers in the provinces of Setsu and Kawachi. In these confraternities, priests formed temple associations and appointed their representatives, and lay followers also appointed their representatives. For example, the Setsu province 12th-day confraternity was a wide area religious group with an administrative temples associations arrangement, as well as connections between temples and residents near temples. The Setsu province River East 13th-day confraternity and River West 13th-day confraternity were also wide area religious organizations comprised of both priests and lay people. Dr. Hino Shosho has done research on these large confraternities. Some confraternities directly belonged to head temples or administrative temples. For example, many confraternities were formed to support Tsukiji Gobo. These included ones with names related to monetary offerings and daily necessities. By connecting confraternities with the administrative temple system, the regional Buddhist institutions came into existence. In other words, through confraternities, lay followers connected with nearby temples. These temples formed associations amongst themselves. These associations were overseen by administrative temples, and these administrative temples throughout Japan were presided over by head temple. In this way, Buddhist institutions existed with autonomous regional organizations serving as their foundations. In this presentation on the administrative temple system and its regional foundations, I discussed how Buddhist institutions were regionally structured. This regional structuring was unlike the main temple branch temple system and the temple parishioner system. The administrative temple system was an important element that enabled Buddhist institutions to operate under the role of shogunate and domain feudal lords. By incorporating its regional foundations, such as temple associations and confraternities, into our analysis, Buddhist institutions' autonomous operations become clear, and the path for re-examining the relationship between these institutions and feudal lords opens up. While this presentation skewed toward examples from the Shinsect, we do find the administrative temple system in other denominations, and temple associations also developed in areas with many temples from the same non-Shinsect denomination. By also examining cases from other denominations, similarities and differences between denominations will become more apparent. This is another task on my research to-do list. That is all for today. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Ueno. And last and indeed least, it's my presentation, which is here. So my presentation is entitled Mokujiki Institutions and Affiliations in Pre-Modern Japan. Mokujiki is exactly what it says. It's eating of wood and trees, and followed with abstention from cereals, which is called kokudachi. It's recognized as an important institution, as we can see from its appearance in the Portuguese-Japanese dictionary produced by the Jesuits. Perhaps they were overly interested in religion. It was also chosen, though, by Kemfa to be taken at some risk, presumably, out of Japan. And that story, the Kochihoin Godenki, is actually about a Mokujiki practitioner who becomes a Sokushinbutsu. And it also appears in a great number of Edo period Japanese materials. So what made Mokujiki such a distinctive practice and indeed distinctive institution? Well, Deal and Ruppert call the type of monk that the Mokujiki practitioners were networking monks. Gorais called them, they say they have a shudansei. So they really have a propensity or a style of practice which centers around creating institutions of their own. It falls within the heading of mountain religion, the hijiri pilgrim guides and itinerants, which existed in the Heian period and after. But certainly within the Edo period context, Mokujiki fits within a context of dietary practice, which is also very closely instantiated in the Fuji cults and in the Sokushinbutsu practice, which is quite famous now, much more so than Mokujiki itself, largely. Mokujiki had a clear Taoist influence with the Sanshi, these three corpses that feed off cereals, the practices involving the body and the Taoist calendar, and of course the Koshin cult, which seems to be ubiquitous wherever Mokujiki practice is to be found. Gorai Shigeru explained that the Mokujiki practice involved the abstention from the cereals that are the staples cultivated by man. So a deliberate attempt to distinguish oneself from other elements of society. Shingon and Tendai Mokujiki Kyodan had distinctive doctrines and institutions with varying degrees of autonomy under the sect authorities. And though the majority of Mokujiki practitioners were low-status gyoja, some institutions were founded by monks of high social and clerical status. The most significant of those institutions was actually on Mount Koya itself, and the practice of Mokujiki as it developed among the itinerant holy men associated with Mount Koya indicated separation from the serial-fed monks. It offered a distinct identity, ascetic path, and social role to those who lacked the connections to gain an elite clerical post. It was certainly given a lot of credibility from the tradition that Kukai practiced it, or at least the abstention from cereals aspect, which we can find in the Goyui Koku materials. The institution on Mount Koya itself, which is wasn't actually itinerant based, but was most important, was the Mount Koya Mokujiki Tokoro. It's very hard to say exactly when it started, but at least it was there in the Sengoku period, and it lasted until the late 19th century. In fact, the head of the Mokujiki Tokoro, the Mokujiki An building, was not actually supposed to leave it at all. Of the three factions which existed on Mount Koya, the Gakuryo, the Gyonin, and the Hijiri, the Mokujiki practitioners affiliated to the Mokujiki Tokoro were of the Gyonin variety, not the Hijiri. So they were quite a distinct group, and we can still visit the graveyard which was set aside for them. And the most interesting thing we can see there, other than get a lot of information about the dates and who was involved, is this stupa, which has a Nokotsuana. So even after death, they retain this institutional affiliation with each other. According to the Kinokuni Meisho Zue, it seems that the Mokujiki An was founded by a certain Choko Shoni. And two things are very interesting about him. Firstly, it's explained that he was involved in kanjin, which is temple fundraising activities. And that seems to be a defining aspect of a lot of Mokujiki practitioners. The other thing that's interesting about him is that he originally belonged to a Renjoin, and that actually is a Gakuryoji in Saindai. So therefore, it's a fair assumption that he was at one point at least a scholar monk or a novice at a scholarly temple. So that shows that people can go into the Mokujiki institution, have it not straight from being a Hijiri or some other lower order, but from a Gakuryoji. The most famous Mokujiki practitioner from Mount Koya is, of course, Mokujiki Ogo, who left warrior life and received 4 Shingon precepts from Seihen on Mount Koya in 1573. Despite having received the 4 precepts, however, he decided not to affiliate to any of the 3 main Mount Koya factions and is described as a kyakuso in the Koya-san Okunoi Mokujiki Tokoro Ketsumyaku, which is the woodblock document you can see on the right of the screen there. Ito Masatoshi begins his book on Muen by suggesting it was Ogo's ambiguous social affiliations that made him the ideal peace broker after Hideyoshi's subjugation of Mount Koya, and then at Sekigahara years later. He certainly took an interest in things that were not on the Mokujiki menu, lots of other foods you can find in his writings, and he's even credited with developing tofu production on the mountain, but these were perhaps practical concerns. It's hard to say whether or not that meant that he didn't practice Mokujiki exclusively, but certainly the practice was of use to him, as we can see, for example, in this Mokujiki. You can see he always uses the title Mokujiki. He was eventually given responsibilities for the oversight of the newly demilitarized Mount Koya by Hideyoshi. And he always turns up as Mokujiki Ogo in official papers, though he was a magistrate and so on and so forth, and had a number of other titles. And that suggests that the institution was distinct and recognizable, and that it definitely played well. Tokugawa Ieyasu there, he actually signs in as Nai Daijin, for example, but Mokujiki sticks to his Mokujiki appellation. That means that it had a certain cachet as an institution, within an institution, if you will. Now, to what extent was that a clearly defined institution? Well, Mokujiki precepts have been suggested by a number of scholars, but it certainly seems to be the case that all of them abstained from the 5 cereals and cooked food, practiced pilgrimage, writing Sanskrit letters, creating statuary, waka, and various works. This distinguishes the practice from Mokujiki as part of mountain ritual, where it's part of the ritual transverse of the Gakido, the realm of hungry ghosts. Gore actually reconstructs 13 Mokujiki precepts from historical materials, but as Miyake Hitoshi has said, this isn't so much a set of precepts as a list of actions and activities that they were involved in. However, there is concrete material evidence of Mokujiki Kai, Mokujiki precepts. For example, the 6th section of Tanzei's own handwritten Dharma transmission lineage document is Fumyaku, writes, all those who aspire to the name of Mokujiki hold to these secret and true precepts. Well, of course, we can't infer that all practitioners vowed to follow the same precepts as Tanzei, but I think it's worth accepting then that some of them did, and that these precepts did exist, and that suggests a certain amount of establishment as an institution. And the other thing to point out is that he mentions that they're secret, which would explain why they're not better known. Of course, Mokujiki itinerancy in the early modern period was part of a wider boom that was caused by a lot of traditional patrons of mountain ascetics being removed or impoverished during the 16th century, the new infrastructure of highways, and the fact that these lower ranking religious specialists were vital to fundraising, but also could do a lot of things, a lot of charismatic things that increasingly established and settled monks couldn't do. For example, perform prayer rites to order, if you will. Mokujiki Shonin is certainly the most famous of the Mokujiki itinerants. He changes his name a few times, but he also sets up a lineage of disciples, including Byakudo and Tankai. But of course, he's best known for his 1,000+ Buddha statues with their famous smile. You can see from this map that of his travels that he covered practically the whole country. And this is another reason for the universality and the recognizability of this practice. A lot of other Mokujiki practitioners did almost as well as he did in getting around the whole country. As for the carving of statues, well, that was certainly a kind of reciprocal thing for the setdai that they received. But as Blacker points out, wood carvers were actually in many ways considered to be a separate occupation to the normal human activities. And I think this might have been another way in which Mokujiki practitioners were considered distinct. It wasn't just the esoteric or the Shugen paradigms that they practiced, though. These are Shingo hanging scrolls produced by Mokujiki Shonin himself, and this was just a matter of these itinerant religious specialists bringing sites of religious significance closer to settled believers. Certainly had, as this Juroku Rakan Yuraiki suggests, rather a rascally appearance. People didn't know whether he was lay or ordained, and he seemed like a madman gone astray, if you will. And in his poetry, we do have a strong esoteric Amidist faith, stories about him receiving setdai, including plenty of things that are not on the Mokujiki menu, and alcohol, and a lot of self-deprecating poetry. He wasn't properly ordained, and he is very hard on himself about it. He did seem to do a few things that were a bit rascally, but his Amidist Nembutsu faith also comes through quite clearly, which is one reason why I think a comparison with the Yuzu Nembutsu Shu, which some Mokujiki practitioners were actually actively associated with, is a fair comparison to make. Certainly, as scholars have done in the past, identified the Yuzu Nembutsu Shu as a group which doesn't fit terribly easily into any of the mainstream sect doctrines, particularly as it taught this kind of group karma doctrine of one person's Nembutsu effect benefiting others. The Hijiri model of networking also is similar. Now, Mokujiki Shonin was a disheveled and rascally wanderer, but others focus more on temple and institution building in the normal sense. So, you know, we have to ask whether they were institutional outsiders or an institution of outsiders or none of the above. Certainly none of the above applies in Enmanji, the Yushima Mokujiki Dera, which was a prayer temple established by Mokujiki Kiko Shonin in 1710 with the patronage of the 6th Tokugawa shogun Ienobu, under the direct control of the magistrate of temples and shrines. As you can see from this Edo Meisho Zue picture from 1836, it was a large and well-endowed temple that even late in the Edo period was still being referred to as Mokujiki Dera. The majority of temples established by Mokujiki practitioners seem to be referred to as Mokujiki Dera. Giko, as you can see on the right there, cuts a fine figure. He was the son of the Ashikaga and the disciple of ordained imperial prince Kakuji of Ninnaji, so definitely an institutional insider in that case. An example of Mokujiki institutions starting entirely through the charisma and the religious spiritual authority of the practitioner is the lineage of Tanzei Shonin. That comes from his experience of having his bones and blood replaced by 5 gods, and having a whole new set of sutras dictated to him, having an experience of mystical oneness with Amida, like Sokushin Jobutsu. And he sets up a direct lineage which dies out sometime in the 18th century. Mokujiki Kyodan, though, can be found in esoteric Pure Land, kami worship, and even Zen traditions. A Tendai Mokujiki sect begins with Tanzei's disciple Mokujiki Tansho and continued with Mokujiki Yoa, who was very famous for his spiritual powers and public works, said to have become a Sokushinbutsu, though his pagoda tomb in the Anshoin has never been officially opened. Perhaps the most interesting temple institution in Tanzei's lineage is the Johatsuganji, which is just up near Odawara. It was supported by the shoguns and many leading daimyo and was given a permission to not meet various public obligations in 1728 from the shogunate. And it had 40 resident monks, which unfortunately reduced down to 2 with the fall of the Bakuhen regime and subsequent loss of lands. And that, of course, accounts for the decline of the Mokujiki institution in general. It was that early Meiji experience that really did it. But Johatsuganji supported pilgrim monks of various backgrounds, not just from the Tendai school, including a lot of Rokujubu based on the temple records and gravestones. It became a branch temple of the Rel01, which was a gakutoji of the Kaiji since 1801, so it shows that there was also a high degree of recognition within the sect. Sadly, the original temple was destroyed in 1937. Completely different tradition exists on Mount Ontake, founded by Mokujiki Fukaku, and also had a disciple who was a Yujo Mami there. Similarly, Mount Hakai, Mokujiki Fukaku Taiken's tradition. The common theme there to both of those is that gaining a divine appellation, a Reishingo, is the aim. Although the Nyujo and bodily paradigms persist, it's definitely in a kami worship mode, as more and more so as time goes on. Moving on to the more famous of the Sokushinbutsu, the Yuden Sankei Gyonin. Mokujiki Gyoja Tetsumonkai is the most famous of all those. We can see his esoteric Amida icon there on the left. But what's not commonly known is that he seems to have been the first of the Sokushinbutsu practitioners to call himself Mokujiki Tetsumonkai. As we can see from these hanging scrolls, he's called himself Mokujiki Gyoja Tetsumonkai here. Now, why did he do that? Well, certainly Mokujiki was part of the process of becoming a Sokushinbutsu, but he wasn't the last to do it. Mokujiki Bukkai, the last extant Sokushinbutsu we see here, and his son himself was Koya-san Mokujiki Bukkai Shonin, or Mokujiki Bukkai Shonin, like that. Here again, we've got Mokujiki Gyoja Bukkai Shonin. And why did they choose to do this? Well, take a look at Mokujiki Tokugē here on your right, cutting a fine figure, looking almost like Kukai himself on his chair with the shoes and so on. And the Mokujiki practitioners who set up their own institutions did so extremely successfully. Not everyone was successful, but considering the power relations that the Issei Gyonin had with Shugenja and with temple monks, you can't blame them for having a certain degree of institutional aspiration, perhaps, and that would be one way to explain this decision to call themselves Mokujiki Gyoja. This also applied to people in the Zen tradition outside of esoteric Buddhism entirely. Or Mokujiki Ryoten practiced all aspects of Mokujiki. You can see here he's calling himself Sendai Zenka Mokujiki Jizai Hoshi. Looking at Mokujiki in the Sendai domain more generally, well, in this map that's left over, we can see a temple simply called Mokujiki, which is often the case, as I said. It starts off with two Shugenja, Bankai Shonin and Chokai Shonin, who appear to have had something to do with the Issei Gyonin or called themselves Issei Gyonin. Then we see the Shingon Shu and Tendai Shu well represented, and a couple of Soto Shu cases. We also see quite a few hiatuses. This could be explained by the fact that the Mokujiki practitioners who managed to set up their own temples are the ones who appeared in historical materials, or it could be that there was a definite hiatus. However, there is a reasonable degree of continuity. There doesn't seem to be much time where Mokujiki practitioners are not coming up in historical materials in the domain. Certainly they were part of this intellectual milieu in which people who had spiritual powers who could provide blessings quickly attracted popularity. It was a period of hayarigami and also a time at which the dead tended to be easily worshipped. This paradigm applies to the Fuji cults, of course. Jikigyo Miroku himself practiced dietary practices extensively, leading up to his Nyujo and becoming a Sokushinbutsu style mami. Sadly, this was destroyed by a jealous rival, according to these documents. An extant Fuji cult, Sokushinbutsu mami, who was a Mokujiki practitioner, is Myoshin Hoshi. He traveled the country, involved in the Fuji cult, Zenkoji, timed his Nyujo to coincide with the 200th anniversary of Iyasu's deification, and is supported by a core of about 40. He achieved Nyujo on the anniversary of Jei's death, which shows the intellectual breadth that's at play here. Now, certainly it was the villagers who wanted his mummy there to attract pilgrims. He had successors in his institution, but they didn't know him personally. So the institution that was set up around him was done almost artificially by the members of that group. It wasn't entirely down to person-to-person transmission. There are two biographies of him. One, the later one, emphasizes the Fuji cult aspects more, which suggests that perhaps that was a time when the Fuji cults were more popular. Now, Mokujiki practitioners were certainly distinctive enough to be singled out for special criticism, partly because of their involvement in these temple fundraising campaigns, not all of which were models of financial probity. In the Shoujiri, we find one being described as a charlatan. In Snow Country Tales, we find the Sokushinbutsu Koichihoin being criticized as against Buddhist doctrine. Ueda Akinari actually talks about his own pilgrimage to the Koyasan Mokujikido, where he excoriates the monks for various reasons, and writes the Nisei no Enishi about a mummified monk who's awakened but turns out to be a very dull and ordinary man. That's what he thinks about Buddhist monks in general, it seems. And then in the Seiji Kenbunroku, we find a lot of rather harsh criticism of Mokujiki practitioners themselves, who, because they don't plant the fields, it's no surprise they don't eat the cereals. The people who plant the fields but don't enjoy the cereals are the ones who we should respect. This idea about all of the Mokujiki practitioners and itinerants and monks being idlers is something that is a common theme to certain intellectuals in Edo Japan, of course, but the fact that the Mokujiki practitioners come up again and again and again for special criticism suggests that it was a clearly distinct institution. So the end of early modern itinerant Mokujiki was, of course, due to the loss of temple lands, but also successive laws limiting the activities of itinerant holy men, scientific understandings of diet and nutrition, and a reduced level of faith in professional asceticism. It localized to sacred mountains and some shrines and temples associated with them. For example, the Fukan Kyokai, Shinshu Kyobun Kyokai, Fukan Kyokai, which is three different institutional names for the same place, founded by Mokujiki Fukan, real name Matsura Rihei, who went to Mount Ontake and had a mystical vision of oneness with the original Mokujiki Fukan, and in 1879 founded this religion. His home village of Momura, the Matsura family still run the religion. Again, this is rather is off his own back. It's on his own authority, isn't it? Mokujiki faded in urban Meiji Japan and in the mainstream Buddhist sects, except as part of a Shugendo remnant mountain rites. Otherwise, dietary paradigm institutions reformed into Shinto-based new religions. You always find a Koshin deity, though, when you find those temples and shrines. As you'll see from this list of kami worshipped, it's a kami worship paradigm. Materials in Inagi city history suggest mainly agricultural and household rites, including Chohei Yoke, interestingly, began to fade in early Showa. So as a conclusion, we can infer a great deal about the intellectual and therefore institutional context of Mokujiki from its vital early modern role, more localized modern transformations, and eventual retreat to the mountains. We see, therefore, the importance of Mokujiki institutions in Edo Japan as a source of charismatic authority outside the standard institutional frameworks. That's charismatic authority as opposed to legal authority and traditional authority, as Weber explained. And I think certainly in this presentation, definitely I'd like to suggest that food and dietary practice as an institutional indicator is something that we really need to consider more. It's become mainstream in Christian thought studies, thanks to the work of scholars like Caroline Bynum. Mokujiki was a means to achieve relatively autonomous practice in some cases for high-ranking monks, but in most cases for those who actively raised funds for their own temples. Mokujiki Kyodan shared a popular morality based on food, agriculture, charismatic leaders, and world renewal with the Fuji Cult, who were part of a distinctively early modern milieu. They demonstrate the importance of dietary practice, not something that could be regulated from above, as an indicator of religious status, doctrine, and institutional identity in pre-modern Japan. Okay, and here are some references just for the record. I'll just go through them. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for your attention. That's the end of my presentation, and it's time to start with the discussion. We'd like to prefer to use Zoom and Zoom chat, if at all possible. Our volunteer will kindly copy and paste in any questions from the Wova chat. I'd like to ask that, in the interest of time, if you have a question for one of the participants in particular, you mention which one that is, and also if to save time, if you have a question for one of the Japanese presenters, you might like to ask that straight in Japanese. And well, when you ask a question, please state your name and your affiliation. Thank you very much indeed. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand in Zoom and I will call on you. I'll also be looking at the chat. Okay. Professor Vasey, thank you very much indeed. Okay. So, question from James Morris, please.
Hello. This is a question for you, actually. I may have missed it just at the end there, so it may have been something you covered because I just popped out. But so with things like Shugendo, they were revived after the Second World War, right? So yeah. I wondered if there's been any attempts to revive Mokujiki. Was
right.
My
so
basic question. Yeah.
In effect, not in its original institutional senses. Certainly it's practiced within Shugendo. For example, if you do the Aki no Mine, Dewa Sanzan, then you'll practice Mokujiki as part of going through the different realms. And it's the Gakido, isn't it? It's the realm of hungry ghosts, is experienced through the practice of Mokujiki. And so you can find it still on Mount Hakkai and Mount Ontake in the same Shugendo mountain context, but it's not a particular institutional identity. with specialists who practice it all the time. Now it's something that's done for a limited amount of time on a mountain practice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Scheidt, if you would.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for these fascinating talks. I have a special question regarding the first presentation, regarding the fact that it was mentioned by Professor Hozawa that some temples existed for for a longer period of time without head priests. I think in the province of Ava, if I remember correctly. My question is, what does this concretely mean? Without head priest, does it mean that they had some subordinate priests, or does it mean that they had no priest at all and that the temple itself was run by the villages?
Okay. So, 住職がないお寺についての話ですね。質問としては、泡のところですね。ちょっと質問としてね、その住職がいなかったという話は、その百姓たちは自分でその寺を運営していたか、なんていう、まあ、宗派の上の方からなんかいろんな支援をもらったのか、具体的にその住職がいないという、話はどういう意味でしたか？
はい。Thank you for your question. すみません、日本語で答えてもよろしいでしょうか。はい。まあ、その住職がいない寺ですけれども、住職がいないと当然その住職がするべき宗教的な行為はできないものですから、今でも住職がいない寺院はその献体寺院、兼ねる帯びる献体寺院といって、近隣の同じ宗派の僧侶がその宗教的な行為を行いますけれども、それはそのように行われます。ただ、そのお寺のその管理については、そのお寺の管理にその村の百姓たちや檀家たちが義務を負っている、あるいは権利を持っているというふうに、そういう趣旨のお話をしましたけれども、そのお寺の管理については、そのそこに権利ないし義務を負っているその村の百姓たちや檀家たちが関わります。こういうお答えでよろしいでしょうか。
ありがとうございます。
Okay, thank you very much. The question from Professor Terwin, please.
はい、長い間日本に行ってないので日本語が錆びてしまいましたけれども、ご発表ありがとうございました。とても面白くお聞きしました。上野先生に対する質問なんですけれども、法律上の問題なんですけれども、もしも住職が何か罪を犯したときに、刑罰されるときに、誰がその刑罰権を持つかっていうことなんですけれども、去年その京阪キリシタン事件という試験について研究をしたんですけども、その場合にはお寺の仲間があって、でその仲間の寺の住職がみんな追放になったり、または罰金を払わされたりしたんですけれども、その表彰書からのその罪の言い渡し状みたいな文書には一応幕府の刑罰としては追放で、後の処分は本山に任せるというような言い回しが書いてありますよね。でそれで寺院のことは 建前だけでもいいけども、一応寺院のことは部の単位じゃなくて、部の責任じゃなくて分のあるところに入るから、一応本山とその本山の奥にあるなんですか、朝廷の責任になるという意味合いがあるのかどうか、そこら辺のことについてお聞きしたいんですけども、いかがでしょうか。
どうもありがとうございます。日本語でお答えしたいと思います。確かに先生のおっしゃる通り、幕府や藩は独自に違法行為に対して処罰することができますが、それぞれの宗派の教団にも独自の法律はありまして、それに基づいてその教団の中の僧侶を処罰することができます。で、本山はもちろん独自に処罰することはできますけれども、今日私が取り上げました触頭という寺院もですね、自らが担当する地域の、寺院の問題についてはですね、独自に対応することができまして、何らかの違法行為があった場合にはですね、その違法行為を行った僧侶を触頭寺院が独自に処罰することができました。ですが、触頭寺院といっても、その権限が強かったり弱かったり、いろいろとありましてですね、例えば、浄土真宗の教団であればですね、触頭寺院にもその3つぐらい等級というか、格付けがありまして、一番上のですね、六書と呼ばれる触頭であれば、本山の代わりにかなり強い処罰もできたんですけれども、それほど権限を持っていない、軽い事柄であれば対応できるけれども、重大問題であれば本山に頼まなければいけないような権限の弱い触頭寺院もありました。そのあたりについては宗派やまた時期によっても変わってくるのではないかと思っています。先生のご質問を聞いて私が思いましたのは以上のようなことです。
Okay, thank you very much. Any more questions? Or comments, perhaps? Okay, it's a round of applause. Thank you very much. Professor Vasey, please.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it took a while for my computer to log on. First of all, thank you all very much for your talks. It's quite interesting. I've read, I think, everything that Hozawa Sensei has ever written. I've always learned a great deal from them, so I greatly appreciate his contributions over the years. My question, though, is actually in regards to your talk, Professor Morris. The Bakufu, as Professor Leno was just pointing out, the Bakufu kind of let religious institutions handle their own problems unless there's a transgression against domain law, murder, arson, things like that. But in the case of these Mokijiki clerics, who are clearly pushing the boundaries of a lot of different practices, did secular authorities ever look in Alaskans upon them and try to stymie this sort of activity? I'm sorry, I had to step out halfway through your presentation, so if you mentioned this before, I apologize. They certainly tried to use Buddhism to restrict mabiki and things like that. I'm just wondering if domain lords and daikon looked at these guys and thought, wait a minute here, this is going too far. This is too itanteki. And I was wondering if there was ever a response to that. And did other schools who didn't participate in this also have negative responses to their activities? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. As for other schools, I haven't got any materials to speak to that from, but it's certainly something I'd like to look into more in future. As for the Bakufu, certainly, as for singling out Mokujiki, and using that term itself. I think there may be various reasons why they didn't do that, some of them being that some of the Mokujiki related temples were actually shogunate prayer temples. And so some of them at least they were happy with. But certainly the Mokujiki practitioners were affected by all those series of laws. I think the first one was in about 1630, regulating unlicensed or pilgrims and itinerants, cutting back on their activities. But as we know, these weren't generally followed properly, and people continue to get away with it to a certain extent. And I think in some of the more rascally cases, such as Mokujiki Shonin, my personal theory on the reason why he changes his name 4 times is that certain sekisho, you know, the gates, they would keep a list of some of the ne'er-do-wells who were constantly going around there. And I think that might be one reason why he had to change his name, actually. So some of them actually, I think, did come into contact with the local authorities. But no, I don't think they were singled out as apart from some of the other you know, itinerants and you know, wanderers of the time. Thank you very much. Okay, we've got a question here from Professor Skoek, or Mr. or Mrs. Skoek, please.
Yes, I'm sorry, the name is Stefan Cook. I don't know why the name the
Sorry.
I've got to change something, probably.
Sorry.
実はちょっと上野先生に短い質問がありますけれども、先生はちょっと増上寺の例でなんか輪番のことを説明したんですけれどもね、ローテーションプリーストということですね。私はその輪番のことを全然知らなかったんですけれども、だからちょっとそれについてなんか詳しく説明ができますか。私ちょっと考えて、輪番は多分もともと増上寺のお坊さんではないかもしれないですね。多分なんか地方からなんか増上寺に呼んだお坊さんとか、ね、そういうことかもしれないですから、どうやってそういう輪番の僧侶を選んで、あとはもしなんか増上寺から地方に帰って、その次はどうやってなんかどうやればいいかな生活しましたとか、そういうことについてちょっとお聞きしたいんですけれども。
どうもありがとうございます。日本語でお答えします。お願
いします。
実は輪番が設置されたのは築地御坊というお寺になります。実は、増上寺の場合はですね、住職がおりまして、輪番はやってきませんが、築地御坊というお寺はですね、輪番がやってきます。で、その輪番はですね、西本願寺の近くに自分のお寺を持っておりまして、で西本願寺にも行って仕事をしているような御堂衆という僧侶になります。でその御堂衆がですね、任命されて築地御坊ですとか、その他のお寺にも行ってですね、数年間、仕事をしております。で、築地御坊の場合は、やはり江戸にありまして、幕府との交渉も務めなければなりませんので、かなり重要な役職になりますので、かなり能力を持った僧侶が築地輪番に任命されていたのではないかと思います。で、そのような僧侶はですね、築地輪番になる前にも、他の触れ頭の輪番として、仕事をした経験を持ったような僧侶がですね、おります。ひとまず以上で大丈夫でしょうか。
Okay, we've just got 1 minute left. If there was one very, very quick question, we could find time for it. Well, perhaps not. So we'd like to say thank you very much to all of the participants. We're really glad that so many of you came. If anyone has any other questions that they'd like to ask, please feel free to contact us through the WOVA system or by email. We'll be pleased to talk to you more at any time. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.